Hello, and welcome to this episode of Such a Nightmare Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and as always, I get to be joined by the one and only Toni Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you join us on our continuation of the Friday the 13th franchise for Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives!
Bum, bum, bum!
He's back, baby. It's the 80s, and they gotta keep cranking these out, and I'm honestly glad they did.
I'm also excited to talk about this film and excited that they kept going. And I wasn't sure that was a statement I would be able to make like 6 films into the franchise, especially after the last couple of films that were more what I always imagined the Friday the 13th franchise to be.
And granted, from our conversation on the 5th one, that one was at least a little bit more interesting. Like, I kind of enjoyed the twist that they did with Tommy at the end more than the general Friday the 13th fan community. But it's a continued...
Yeah, it's also just like nudity for nudity's sake, you know.
Yeah, it just continues the trend of it is a little bit worse each time. But this one, I would say it kind of turns it around. It brings in some postmodern humor, a little bit of meta comedy, a lot of meta comedy actually in here for the first time. There's a little less nudity, like in this one.
Significantly less.
And yeah, I think I read in my research somewhere that this has the least nudity of any Friday the 13th movie ever. Even though it does include of course it's Friday the 13th. You still got to have a sex scene, but
oh, absolutely,
they were clothed during that.
They were.
They had asked the actress to take the top off, but she declined. As she should. I mean, it wasn't necessary. Yeah. It didn't matter.
Before we jump into our full discussion and the scholarship, because there is, not surprisingly, scholarship for this film, would you, Toni, give us a brief reminder of what happened in this particular film?
So following fan outrage, producers caved to fan desires and retconned the events of Friday the 13th, Part 5. Almost immediately, Tommy, he's back, but he is definitely not Jason. Jason is dead, and so Tommy goes and he's like getting really paranoid, and so he's gonna like make sure he's gonna take care of Jason's body once and for all, but through some kind of Frankenstein-esque shenanigans, almost, is like the best way to describe it. Lightning strikes and Jason comes back to life. And nobody believes Tommy at all. I mean, honestly, kind of in this universe as they shouldn't. He's portrayed as paranoid, and it makes sense within the context of the universe. But that allows Jason to kind of go back on a killing spree, back through the camp where it all began. And there's a lot of deaths, a lot less nudity, but it's basically Jason on steroids.
And that's a really good setup for some of the scholarship that I want to talk about, that phrase of Jason on steroids, because the 2 pieces that I'm going to reference are both from the Horror Homeroom's Friday the 13th at 40, which we've been using all along in our discussion, because it's just a bunch of really great, very accessible, very readable pieces. And there are 2 out of the like 10 or 12 articles over the entire franchise. There are 2 that are explicitly on Jason Lives, which I think tells you that there's a lot with this text to work on.
Yeah.
And one of them is by a person named Matthew Jones, and it's called Reanimating Collective Ecological Nightmares in Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives.
Okay.
And Jones...
That's a fascinating title right there.
Yeah, and Jones is an independent film scholar and film studies, photography, and media teacher, and looks a lot at eco horror. And his argument is that in Jason Lives, Jason is presented to us as sort of the true definition of a monster as given to us by Noel Carroll. So Noel Carroll wrote The Philosophy of Horror. It's a really great sort of investigation into him trying to explain why horror is really important at a time when no one was receiving it as a critically important field. And Carol talks about the fact that there's hybridity that it causes monstrosity, right? That thing that is neither one nor the other is what disturbs us the most. You look scared or confused.
I just was wanting to ask and position this in time. When did the original monster thesis kind of come out? And because I'm curious where this film is situated within that initial discussion. This film came out in 1986, and so I'm just kind of curious where the original monster discussion and kind of framing the horror genre kind of comes in as important.
That's a really good question. Carol's book comes out in 1990.
1990.
And Carol's book is called The Philosophy of Horror, or Paradoxes of the Heart. And Carol is really looking at how what he calls art horror, right, is enacting certain fears and anxieties. Monster Theses, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast, by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, that doesn't come out until 96. So that one's definitely later. But I think that what's smart about Jones's article is that he's placing this in relationship with contemporary to this film's time, because he actually starts by talking about the fact that this is his first sentence of his piece. In 1986, a cataclysmic environmental disaster at a nuclear plant in Russia fell upon the whole of the continent, afflicting and forever altering the life inhabiting its natural world. Right, so he starts by talking about Chernobyl, and he talks about the fact that there were these other things happening at that time in the sort of zeitgeist. There was a Times Beach incident in Missouri. There was a pesticide poisoning in California. There was the Bhopal disaster in India. Like, he lists all of these real world ecological nightmares that are happening like right around the time. And Chernobyl actually happens after Part 6 comes out. But, nevertheless, it's this time when we are, to go to that term he's using, engaging in a collective ecological nightmare. And his argument stems from the fact, in part, that with Jason, because he's Jason on steroids, he's really neither human nor non-human. He's almost just a force of nature. And the fact that lightning strikes to bring him back, that it's nature that literally brings him back, but also that even in that opening sequence, it's not only that lightning strikes multiple times and brings him back to life, but also the rain prevents Tommy's plan from working, where he tries to set him on fire. So it's like he's a representative of the nature that will keep going, that we have no control over. And it's interesting to sort of read Jones's discussion about the eco-gothic and how the eco-gothic, this is a quote that he's referencing, interrogates and interprets the intriguing darkness in our increasingly troubled relationship to and representation of the more than human world. I think it's an interesting argument, particularly for understanding Jason as something that's like, he's not the human of the previous films. He really has become something more. I don't know if this is my favorite examination of Jason Lives, because it doesn't seem quite as convincing to me as the other piece. But of course, he talks extensively, as he should, about the fact of how much of this happens in nature, right? And sort of the ways that it causes us to interpret and investigate how uncomfortable nature makes us feel.
I agree that it is an interesting argument. I'm kind of curious to hear what the second piece of scholarship is, and to kind of hear how then we can kind of maybe talk about these two in relation to each other before diving into our own thoughts of Jason Live. Because I'm curious if what angle is this other one coming at it from?
Yeah, so what I like about Jones's piece is that he has a very explicit, clear argument that encourages me to have thoughts, whether or not it's entirely in alignment. The other piece, I think, is when I tell you what the topic is, you're going to be like, well, that makes sense to me. So it's by an individual named Brian Finelli, who writes about the genre of horror and all sorts of different things, and is an assistant professor at Lackawanna College, or at least was when they were updating their bio. And Finelli's piece is titled "No Clowning Around the Gothic and Comedic Elements of Jason Lives."
Okay, you see,
so
that it's a good title.
And so you read this piece and you're like, I'm not sure anyone who reads this piece is like, I just completely disagree with this. I don't feel like it was well supported. Whereas I think that there's room for people to have pushback in Jones's, which makes Jones have the harder argument to sell. But it was interesting just sort of reading Finelli's evidence to really support just the fact that this is a funny film. And from the opening scene where, we're having all of these references explicitly to Frankenstein, the director, McLaughlin, said, my main objective was to give the audience a sense of the old Gothic horror movies because I was trying to set a tone right from the beginning that this was going to be what the universal horror movies used to be. A stormy night, going to the cemetery, digging up the grave, and a monster coming back who's unstoppable. And
I had found that quote
Finelli,
particularly
yeah,
fantastic. I pulled that from my research as well into the film, into kind of the backstage filmmaking, and it was he like literally name drops the film, the early 1930s
yes,
Frankenstein film, and he talks about pulling direct shots, and I think you see that, and I love that Finelli is highlighting that here.
yes,
It's a really good, it's a really clever example of the film being just that, clever. It's
yes,
not an beat you
yes.
over the head with it kind of joke. It is what the film is engaging in. It's like a very postmodern. I use that up top in my description. It's referencing something else, but showing it, presenting it in utterly a different fashion.
Well, and Finelli even talks about in his piece that Kevin Williamson has directly cited this film as something he had in his head when he was working on Scream, right? Which is another obviously very postmodern meta film. And that's my favorite part about Jason Lives. So I appreciate the Frankenstein setup and all of that, but for me, the movie is funny, and it's funny in some really clever ways, starting with that first shot of Jason through the eye of Jason, just like it's a James Bond movie, right? We have a James Bond reference. We also have the whole time, with the gravedigger, it's really hard not to think of Shakespeare in those
I was
moments,
gonna say the
particularly the breaking of
Hamlet.
the fourth wall.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then there's just some really great moments of dialogue. So those are the two pieces of scholarship. So I want us to keep in mind the ways in which this is, I think, an eco horror film, if eco horror is fascinated with that which is not entirely human,
yeah.
and the ways that this is a comedy as much as it is a horror.
I think I'm like willing to buy the eco horror argument because I think it also, particularly because of maybe also how it plays into like zombies largely,
Yes.
and like because I think this is also a fascinating example of like a natural born more zombie or Frankenstein kind of like monster esque creature.
Yes.
And I think that to you can extend that. I think it's interesting that Jones chooses to extend that to an ecological perspective. It's not what I definitely got on my first read, so I was intrigued to kind of hear that argument. And I wonder if like going back and like rewatching the film with maybe that in mind, I might be like, oh yes. I mean, I'm already thinking of it now, like them running through all the forest and all the camp is
Hmm.
so much outdoors. Almost, I think almost every kill in this movie happens
Yeah.
outside. So
Yes.
you know
I think
what?
you're right.
I think it's now it's making me want to go back and rewatch this film already.
Jones even talks about in reference to that, your idea about the zombies, right? He talks about the makeup decisions. That before Jason puts on his mask, he is in these natural neutral color palette
Yeah.
that is very greens and browns, and is not necessarily, I would assume, what a reanimated corpse who had gone through all the things that Jason's body had gone through might be, right? It's really much more, it makes him feel very natural, even as he is simultaneously this unnatural creature. So I think that Jones has arguments to make, but that are really sound. But I think you're right that it just takes a little bit more investigation to get there. Whereas,
Yeah.
Finelli's, you're like, ah, yes, this makes sense to me that these
Yeah.
comedic elements you're discussing are in there.
I think it's definitely much more of like it's like a case of like Benelli's tapping into the text, whereas Jones's diving argument requires you to really dive into the subtext of the film.
Yes.
And I think both
But
are
this is a film that has subtext.
yes, I was about to say. I was like, I think we had, despite our kind of like mild enjoyment, I would say, of the fifth one, we were pretty critical of how like just straightforward everything is exactly as you expect it to happen. Literal, basic kind of like slasher. The fifth one was. I can't really say that about this one. It really
No.
kind of takes you in some weirdly comedic directions. I like the way that the story plays with Tommy And I was did in my research, they kind of reference it in a video game, the events of the fifth movie. They're like that they established canonically that it was a dream.
Right.
Classic classic horror logic,
Yes,
where it's
yes.
just whatever you need to do to get to the next one. But you know what? It was pretty fun.
Yeah, one of the things that I struggled with in the fifth film, and I've struggled with increasingly as the franchise has built, is that this is a franchise full of some really zany characters that are just wildly weird, right? And I think the fifth one, I think about the mother-son duo that are
Yes.
like at the trailer park and he's literally eating slop. And there's this weird affect where I think it's being used as a comedic device, but it's not being used, but it's not funny, right? And it's not funny
Yeah.
because the source of horror, actually, well, the source of horror as well, but the source of comedy is unclear. Like, are we supposed to be laughing because this is a satirical portrayal and it's supposed to make us have thoughts about like society? Or are we supposed to be laughing because it's just so ridiculously over
Disgusting.
the top? Yeah,
Yeah.
or disgusting. And I think the answer is that they don't know. They just kind of shoved it in there and assumed that we would find it funny. Whereas this film builds these comedic moments with intention. I think one of the best examples I can think of is the paintballing team.
Yes,
Right?
the corporate paintball scene is
Yes.
so funny.
Yes.
And it's so I remember getting to that part and being like the specificity of the scene, I
Yes.
think, is what makes it so funny, is because you're like, how many things can actually be done in the woods? And you're like, actually, if you think about it, there is a weird number of things that you can rent out the woods to do. And this corporate paintball, it gets you to introduce Jason to a different kind of character and killing a different kind of person than he typically does. He usually, I mean, he's been killing, like, as we've been saying, is increasingly like these like non-human, like these like uncanny valley human people,
Yes.
essentially, where they are like, you're basically rooting for them to die. And I mean, you are still kind of, you're not like super invested in these corporate assholes or whatever, but it's a different kind of person, which is fun.
It is, and it allows us to have some actually really pointed sources of humor, because there's first off the idea that like there's the one guy says to his friend, he's like, I don't like who you become when we're playing paintball, and he's like, I'm not in sales, I'm a killer, I have killer instinct or something like that. And this, I think, really, actually, I would love to hear Finelli and George kind of enter in a conversation together, because what this scene is reminding us is that we as a society really don't have a killer instinct when compared to killers. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so there's that whole element in there, but then there is also, and Finelli talks about this is a film that is highly critical, very intentionally and explicitly, of masculinity in a way that we haven't seen since some of our early films. So of course we have Jennifer, who's constantly sort of being antagonistic towards her dad, the
Yeah.
sheriff. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Megan. Megan is the one who is dad is the sheriff. Yes, okay, so Megan, the character, right, is constantly questioning her father. And I think that Jennifer Cook does an excellent job of sort of playing in that role.
Yeah.
Obviously, this insurance worker, the sort of, the paintballing scene, they're talking about how, this is a man's game. And then, of course, the woman kills them. And then, of course, we have toxic masculinity, where that one guy's throwing a sort of hissy fit with his machete. And then, of course, the machete gets used on him. But there's also that scene, we have the people who first stumble upon Jason, and she's like, nope, I've seen those horror movies. We need to leave. And he's like, no, we don't.
No, yeah.
Then there's also the scene of the couple where she's like, I'm so sorry that I thought you lured me out here to have sexy time. And then he says all the lines that we would expect a woman to say. He's like, well, I have a headache and I don't know, I'm just tired, and just kind of making fun of that. And then there's the sex scene, which is also making fun of sort of traditional masculinity, because, the guy isn't able to even last 10 minutes. And, partly because he's a bad driver and not attuned to the situation, the girl he's with dies as fast as she does, and so there's all of these ways, again, where the comedy is so explicitly purposeful, and that is really exciting to see.
Yeah. And I really do just think that it was a fun way to kind of recontextualize the franchise, and really, I'm glad that the producers kind of like took a look at their kind of mistakes that they had been making with the franchise so far, and kind of adjusted course to highlight it is pretty silly, a lot of this stuff. I mean,
Oh, it's
Jason,
delightfully
it's
silly.
like, and I think that by kind of like leaning against it and like trying to make Jason more into a Mike Myers type of stoic, godlike figure, which is clearly what the fans they wanted after the fifth one.
Yes.
And I think by they do give it to them in the sixth one, but it's also constantly questioning why you want that. Is this necessary? And I think it also kind of does justify it by doing these really interesting things with toxic masculinity that like you were mentioning. I think that's a really fascinating art. I hadn't really picked up on that either when I was just watching it. I think I was so delighted just by like the by
Yeah.
so much of the comedy, and I liked how they brought us back to the camp in a really interesting way this time around. It had been renamed something. I can't remember the name, the new name of it.
Forest Green,
Forest Green.
which
Yes,
again goes back to Jones's, discussion about how this film is making us question whether we can ever claim nature as tamed.
absolutely. Oh, that's pretty interesting. Also, I think it plays into this like desire for us to, after tragedy, just rebrand and move on. Like,
Exactly.
which is I fascinating critique to think about from like 1986.
And it's particularly fascinating to think about in a film that is doing that very thing, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's
because the film
rebranding
is like, you're
itself.
right. You didn't like the last film. You didn't like Where We Go. We heard you. We are rebranding and fixing it. And so it's really delightfully amusing that they are acknowledging that that rarely works because you can't bury the past, but also, right?
And I guess to a certain degree, it like did a little bit. This film has a much more positive reception from the fan base. It got a bit more positive response from critics even at the time. For what it's worth, the Rotten Tomato aggregate has it somewhere around the 50s range as of when we're recording it, which is, middling. It's a Critics are particularly tough on horror as a genre
Yes.
as a whole, particularly at this time, because I didn't realize that these horror scholars had written those pieces so late. In my mind, I had kind of positioned them closer to maybe the 70s or early 80s, but it's interesting to see
Yeah.
those come 90s.
So
But
even when I was working on my dissertation in the like around 2015ish, even then I don't think we had quite hit that period where it was acceptable to do this unless you'd first established yourself somewhere else.
yeah,
Right? Like so Carroll's a philosopher that happened to be very successful and then wrote a book. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, I think, is like an anthropologist or
yeah,
sociologist or something like that. So there's definitely, like the 90s, those are our trailblazers. And for a very long time, it was like these are the only people that were really reading. That doesn't mean that those were the only people writing horror, but those were the only ones that like people would suggest when you were doing your scholarship.
yeah.
So, for 1986, yeah, it's not going to be super a cultural darling, right? A critical darling, because I don't think it's been until Heel and Astor and some of the recent films that we've begun to re-acknowledge,
Or
right? That it
I
can be.
guess maybe some stuff from like maybe Craven, like from like
Yes.
particularly from like Scream, and I think there's been a re-examination of those films culturally, but definitely not necessarily at the time.
No, at the time, the New York Times wrote, but despite a few lighter touches, the film is still a gory waste of time that plays its murders for all the blood and guts they're worth. And Siskel said the film was the least offensive in the series, but labeled it as an all too familiar bloody ritual,
Yeah,
which to me means that Siskel is not familiar with what's happening because it actually is not, in comparison, a familiar ritual. But that's what's being said at the time. I do want to talk about a little bit more. You mentioned the how lovely it was to return back to the camp, and I thought that
yeah,
this film's use of the children was really effective. Sometimes just for humor, one of my favorite moments that happened like in 30 seconds was when the girls were sleeping in their beds. It showed the one little girl who was writing a really painstakingly handwritten note to
yeah.
home that just said like I have arrived at camp, and then it pans over or cuts to the girl reading Sartre. I was like, this is golden, And of course, there's the famous line about, the dead meat, and the one little
Yeah,
boy asked the other little boy, like, what did you want to become if we'd been allowed to grow up? And that dead meat line, of course, is where the YouTuber Dead Meat
Dead Meat, yeah.
title comes from. But even
Dead Meat
there's a scene.
he has a good video about this one.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, and this is where he kind of got started, right? Was by looking at the Friday the 13th franchise. And even like the interactions with the camp counselors and the kids is reminds us of the ridiculousness of camp, right? Because we have a group of teenagers who often received no training in how to take care of or educate or like keep alive small children. And that scene where Core is like making up that story about Native American markers, and he's like, and if the dad just wants to get away, and like it was just delightful.
Also love that even though like two of their friends like die pretty quickly into like them starting, they're just like, well, we just got to keep on keeping on. Not really like gonna investigate that too much. La di da di da. Camp must go on.
The weird thing, right, about camp is like you're usually not that far away from civilization. You might be a couple of hours, right? But like you're never. There's always a phone or something that you have access to. But we always treat camp as though like, well, them's the breaks. You're in the middle of nowhere, so I guess you just have to die. Instead, it's like, why can't we just take the bus and leave? Like,
absolutely.
It's so interesting.
It's pretty silly, but
yes,
but that's what I like about it. It's like it just treats this. But what is different than like what I don't always love is like when it just treats these situations as super silly. I think that what I like is that the actors within each of these scenes like treat the situations as pretty seriously, and they're not telling jokes necessarily.
Yes.
There's like those occasional moments of cutaway to the camera, like where the guy is like, why would you bring back Jason? Or whatever,
right?
Where it's like really okay, that's a little corny. It's kind of funny, but it's corny. But most of it, they kind of keep the internal stakes of it and just like let you laugh at the situation or the little jokes that like the visual gags that they set up, which is very fun. I think it shows a surprising amount, and I can't believe I'm saying this about a film in this franchise, but restraint that is not necessarily. I mean, this franchise has not always had that restraint.
That's an interesting word to use. First off, you're right, for the franchise, but also for a film that also gives us in the first few minutes a really explicit nod to James Bond films, because it's not a film that is afraid to go places. So when you think of restraint in this film, what are you meaning?
I really like the storyline that they keep going back with Tommy, where they keep very seriously, like they lock him up, he has to escape, he goes on this really serious journey, and all of this wacky shenanigans is happening around it, but they keep the stakes up during that, and like, they will have these kind of silly long jokes that they'll do, or the cutaways, like I mentioned, but I think in comparison to like with the fourth and fifth film, especially of this franchise, where it just kind of felt like they were doing these weird, grotesque jokes, or like jokes that were like just their characters are just, I'm an obnoxious person. Like, I feel this film at least does us the courtesy of gesturing better at characters, particularly in the case of Tommy and Megan, and the police officer character. I think they give us some pretty interesting characters here that kind of ground the story, and like, I guess maybe restraint is the wrong word. Maybe it's a little bit more grounded than some of the other films, even despite the silly like bits that it's doing.
Yes. There's a feeling in particularly I think 4 and 5 where it almost feels like they used a Mad Libs exercise, right? Where they were like, give me a character that feels wacky to you. And they're like,
yes.
a weird mother-son duo where she feeds him slop. And they're like, brilliant. That's in there now. And then they just like shoved them in. Whereas I think you're right. I think grounded is the best phrase, because McLaughlin is clearly keeping everything authentic to the world he has crafted.
Well, like the corporate folks are a great example in the paintball. Like, those are like real human beings that maybe you've bumped into at the bank or something, or like at the supermarket. And that's a very interesting real life situation that, it's pretty humorous. You probably, I've never done that myself, gone out on a corporate paintball retreat, But you know what? It does feel like something that someone in like a high level sales department would get to do as like one of their perks. And I feel like that's a very specific kind of funny example that is very human and grounded, but it's so specific and that's why it's funny. Rather than
There's
being just
even
oh go ahead, go ahead.
oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Rather than I think in some of the other ones, like we were saying, it's just an amalgamation of like here's some bad character traits. Let's just like put a character. That's a character now.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's even to go into that corporate retreat element, there's a couple of horror movies that is their entire premise, right? Severance, which came out in 2006, that is about a team building retreat in the mountains where they're hunted down one by one. There's a film called Corporate Animals that came out in 2019. That's also a corporate retreat theme. So this is something that like I think people began to realize the absurdity that is corporate retreats.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that that's what McLaughlin asked himself was not what is absurd, but what is absurd that actually happens in real life. That's the thing we can investigate. And every single situation in this film, like you said, we've run into people like that. We've been in situations like that. There was nothing in there that you didn't understand where that was coming from. Even with our police, you know, there was the guy who was really excited about having his laser scope. Yeah. That also felt surprisingly authentic. You know, there was just everything about the film. The characters, I think you're right, they felt real in a way that we haven't seen
in the franchise
for a while.
And so I think that that's maybe like grounded and restraint are like, I think they are fitting words for it. And despite the overall silliness that it brings, which I think is fun. I think that's a fun addition to it. I like that you get to kind of like have your stoic, big Jason imposing, but also he's going to have to do a silly James Bond bit too.
Yeah.
And like, you know what? He's going to get to be stoic and brooding and kill a lot of people, but he's also going to do a silly little bit. And
yes. And even the lines that fell for me, like when the gravedigger has the line about like, what do they think I am, a fart head, right? You know, that line obviously didn't cause me to roll laughing, but there were several times I did laugh out loud at this film. But knowing that even that ridiculousness maybe doesn't have a real world framework, but has this very explicit literary history, right? Of the fool who's often a gravedigger, who's breaking the fourth wall, who's having these conversations that you're like, I don't know what's happening. This feels very real, but also very fake and staged. Like whether or not that's that particular character he was thinking about Hamlet when he crafted it, you can tell that McLaughlin is very aware
of the larger tradition.
Of the larger traditions in horror, in Friday the 13th, and even just in pop culture, right? We have him using the Frankenstein reference at the beginning, and then when the scene with Court in the RV, right? They're listening to Alice Cooper's Young Frankenstein. So there's just lots of ways that this film is just very aware. To go back to the thing you said at the beginning, that makes it a postmodern film.
And the film did pretty well at the box office. These films thrive on costing nothing to make, and particularly in the film of like larger Hollywood. It costs $3 million to make and earned $19.4 million at the U.S. box office.
I mean, I would take it.
It's enough to get greenlit for a sequel, and
that's kind of what you have to do. And I do want to say again how appreciative I am by how explicitly this film says, we heard what you were saying and we will fix it. It's in the title, and it's also in that song that's playing while the credits are rolling, which was a delightful song where they're like, Jason's back alive and doing the things you want him to do. And you're like, this is a film that is really explicitly saying, we heard you and we are course correcting accordingly.
It's interesting. I guess film producers were a lot more attuned to their audiences back then, or at least the people who were like literally showing up to the theaters.
Yes, the people who were paying for things.
Yeah, so which, you know, it's interesting. It would seem to work out.
Definitely not a world we live in now.
Not necessarily. I still can't believe that the director of The Nightmare ever said that quote to a reporter about not liking the franchise that he was working on a movie for. And I know that happens later on in the Friday franchise, so we'll get there eventually. But I just like the things you're working on, people. And I feel like they liked
and
the
don't
thing
make
they were
everyone
working
be
on in this one.
miserable.
Yeah,
Don't make everyone be
absolutely.
miserable. There was a recent article that I didn't click on because I didn't need to, but it was, I mean, like it just came out. So we're filming on the 12th for our own Friday the 13th of 2023. It just came out like in the last week that was by one of the actresses that was in Nightmare. And it said that couldn't be in any more horror films because of how just terrible of an experience being on that film was. Because in part of the director, I think, and the conditions and like, whereas you get the impression that in this film and Jason Lives, they're having a good time.
Yeah.
And I did like Tommy, the actor that played Tommy, better in this film because he wasn't playing a version of Tommy that he thought was from a serious role. And I keep going back to your like sharing in the last episode that the actor who played Tommy thought he was in a serious film about mental illness.
Yes.
And which is, it's not funny that he did all that prep work, but it is funny.
It is so funny. No, it is funny. They
it's so
lied to
clear.
him, and
oh my gosh, and he's so tortured in that. He plays such a
Yes.
tortured version of Tommy in that film that is not appropriate for the script.
No,
right?
absolutely
Whereas
not. It's not
this Tommy, which we got this actor
Yes.
playing Tommy because the previous actor became a born again Christian and didn't want to reprise his role, which is also like an interesting another element to add to the story of that actor.
Yeah, good film overall. I'm glad we kept going through this franchise. The last one was a little bit like, I don't know where they're going to go with this. I knew that they were course correcting, but I didn't think they could course correct kind of this hard. You tell me,
Yes.
though, that I should not get you said this right before we started recording, that I should not get my hopes up going forward. Is that referring to the immediate next film, do you know? Or is that just in general?
I don't know. What I can tell you is how Finelli ends his article, and I will go into that in a second. I do want to say that I think that one of the things McLaughlin gives us is these moments of awareness of also the, like, I mean, there's a character named Heather, right, who's having nightmares. And there are all of these things that he does that, again, go back to the restraint that create a very strange peak, right? I think with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, we kind of talked about how it's like they feel very nesting doll-esque, right? Like each one's kind of adding on the other, even when they have nothing to do with the previous story. But this one really feels more like it's, just kind of like a line graph. And we have this really sharp peak with this film. Because what Finelli says is that Part 7, A New Blood, sees Kane Hodder take up the hockey mask and resume that role for several more sequels. And I will say, many people are a huge fan of Kane Hodder as Jason. So he's one of the most beloved Kane Hodders.
Yes.
Or not, he's not one of the most beloved Kane Hodders. He's one of the most beloved Jasons, Kane Hodder is. But then Finelli says that the next film, A New Blood, is more serious in tone. However, more than 30 years after its release, Jason Lives remains a fan favorite because it did something different with the exhausted franchise. It referenced horror history, including locations named Karloff's General Store and Cunningham Road, and it infused several Gothic elements that nod to the Universal era. Furthermore, its unique style of comedy was a breath of fresh air in a series that had largely become stagnant. McLaughlin masterfully balanced laughs with memorable kills, often within a single scene. As a result, Jason Lives is the Friday the 13th sequel that resonates more than many of the others.
That's
so based
beautiful.
on just how Finelli's describing it, I assume that it's going to get a little bit less, right? That it's just going to sort of begin to deteriorate again as a franchise, but we'll find out.
And I also can't believe we didn't mention until the very end, they swapped out the Jason.
Yes.
And did you know the story of where they found this guy?
No.
Oh my gosh. So he was working at a restaurant that also kind of did like live performances. And during one sequence, there was this sequence in which a magician hypnotized people into thinking they were in Friday the 13th. And this guy played Jason in this like magic act sketch.
Oh my gosh.
Somebody involved with the film saw the sketch and brought the film team to it. And then they were like, that guy's great. Let's hire him.
That's hysterical.
So the guy, original person who played Jason, they left him in for the paintball scene because they had shot him, but they didn't really like the new team didn't really like his performance. So they had found this guy in a magic act, and then they were like, you're Jason. Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy, and I love the sheer ridiculousness of a magic act that makes you think that you're living a horror film, because that feels fake to me, right? If I saw that in a horror movie, I'd be like, that's so silly. But the fact that's real actually makes the scene in Jason Lives, where they're playing the card game Camp Blood, and she's like, okay, the goal is to find Jason. Like, that makes that scene even wittier. That's so delightful.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I remember just kind of reading that through. It was almost as crazy as the like evangelical Christian guy who didn't want to come
Yes.
back, in terms of just so much wacky things involved in the making of it. Yeah, he was from the area he was a restaurant manager and former soldier, and it was a stage. He was a part of the stage show. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I that was a I, the reason
Yeah,
I love
that's
researching
fantastic.
the
I know, I
making
know.
of
I
them, because
was,
you find these crazy little facts about like how the sausage gets made.
yes. And I would so rather find out, like, I like those things, right? Like whenever we're finding out that, the writer directors were these like garbage people that
Yeah,
basically made everyone on set miserable. I don't need to read those stories anymore. So I'm glad that, we have a writer director like Tom McLaughlin who's creating an intriguing environment, and an environment where someone feels comfortable saying, this may sound wacky, but I just saw this magic routine. I found our new
yeah.
Jason. Like, that's fantastic.
CJ Graham does a really that's the name of the person we've been referencing. He does a pretty good job as Jason. I liked Bradley was pretty good. I mean, he's always
Hmm.
been solid, but honestly, I hate to say it's not that difficult, because I mean, I definitely couldn't do it, but he does a great job.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, his job is to be big
Kill
and
people
kill people. And I think that between his physicality and some of the
and
decisions
his training in
directorially.
the Magic Act.
Yeah. And there is even this, Jones talks about the fact in his argument of the sort of nature and the inhumanness of Jason. He does talk about the fact that Jason appears and disappears almost magically, right? That with this like sort of supernatural, like he's literally somewhere he wasn't just 2 seconds ago. So that also just adds another delightful element. We would love to, as always, hear from you all about what are your thoughts. Both Toni and I are very cognizant of the fact that we are talking about a franchise that people have very strong feelings about. And we are both like babes in the wood,
Absolutely.
and that we have not sat with these films as long as many of you have. So we would love to know your
No.
thoughts.
You are there are definitely people who have seen these films way more than us, and we'd love
Oh,
to
yeah.
hear your opinion. So get in touch with us via
Considering
our
that
social
some of these
media.
films,
Yeah,
you only have to have seen twice to have seen more than us.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
So get in touch with us
social
via
media.
our social medias, which are linked here. Our email. You can also get in touch with us. So if wherever you listen to your podcast, go ahead and give us a rating there. We'd love to hear from you there. That helps us get the word out about our next episodes.
Huzzah! Before we tell you what our next episode is, I want to make sure to thank Jackson O'Brien, because he is the reason that this episode sounds as fantastic as it does. So thank you so much
Jack.
for editing this episode. Toni, what should people watch and be prepared to listen to the next episode on?
So we are definitely going to return to the Friday the 13th franchise. So if people want to continue and watch the 7th Entry, we will get there soon enough. So we'll be there soon. But we are, before going there, going to go to a more recent horror fair and talk about 2022's Barbarian. So if you haven't seen it, you can check that one out. It's on HBO Max for those who are subscribed there. And you can also rent it wherever you get videos.
Thank you so much for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spectacular day.